All right, hi everybody. The purpose of this screencast, I know some of you are having some questions about what your notes should look like as far as reading, active reading, and answering responses. So I'm going to go ahead and click on tonight's assignment, the Jim Crow North article. I'm going to kick it out to Notability to show some active reading and writing. Whoops, I need to view my attachments first. Let's open up the article first. A quick tip, when you do kick things out to Notability, many of you may be clicking on Notability right here. However, if you go a little farther until you get to the three dots, and then you go past the first Notability down to Copy to Notability, it will enter the note for you with the name already in place so that you do not have to do that yourself. So now I have the article open and I'm going to go ahead and choose a color that I want to work with and hope my pen is charged and will turn on here. So the very first thing I do when I go to read anything is kind of check out what's going on. So I notice right away that I have this title, The Jim Crow North, and it's pretty bold on a red background. So I'm already asking myself why the printers chose this. I'd also probably read this. You know about the long fight against segregation in the South, but civil rights struggles in the rest of the nation have been overlooked. Okay, and I live in Pennsylvania, so I'm already thinking about PA and the North. This article is part of Upfront's ongoing series about the African American history experience inspired by the New York Times 1619 project. So I'm wondering what that is, but probably not relevant to my homework at this point. I'd also glance at the pictures. So here I see students. I'm just going to highlight as I read. I wouldn't necessarily do this to take my notes. Students march across the Brooklyn Bridge to protest segregation. 64. So I'm going to have a personal connection here because I was born in 1965. So this is almost in my lifetime that this is happening. I may note some of the fashions and styles, hair, clothing, cars, things that kind of hint back toward that time. Again, I'm just activating my brain to get ready to read. Here's a sign in Detroit calling for a continuation of segregated housing. Okay, continuation means segregated housing's already in place. So I'm already asking myself, why? Who made the segregation policy? Is it a city policy? Is it a Michigan policy? Is it a USA policy to have segregated housing? I'm also noting that 1942, I know that is during, that's a W, World War II years. So I'm wondering if people moved to Detroit maybe to work in some of the industries to help prepare for the war. And if so, why would you be so rude as to segregate housing? Maybe that's what the workers themselves wanted. I don't know. We want white tenants in our white community. So I'm assuming this refers to Detroit. I noticed the use of the flag as a symbol. Symbols not so unfamiliar in today's conversation. I would proceed then to look at the rest of the pictures and captions because I think that has great value. So here, riots erupt in Boston. Okay, so now I'm in another city. I was in Detroit before, now I'm in Boston. They're opposing the city's plan to integrate schools. And now we've jumped ahead almost a decade here to 1976. And again, I can tell by some of the fashions and the hairstyles that maybe this is the 1970s. Why are we in Boston? Okay, Boston, Detroit. Both, okay, are northern cities. So notice how I'm thinking constantly about what I'm reading. And that's the goal in being an active reader. So I'd continue on. I might notice this, we've developed a national myth of de facto segregation, the fact, de facto. So de jure segregation, I know from past knowledge, is actually the legal laws. De facto is kind of, it just is. This is the way it is. A guy opens a door for a woman, not because it's a law, but just kind of the fact is that's what's traditionally done, or at least used to be traditionally done. So we've developed the national myth that that's just the way it was. We just kind of segregated. That's just what people did. There were no laws that made it so. But I think we'll discover in this article that indeed laws and restrictions were put in place to make segregation happen. I also noticed the article includes a timeline, and I'm excited because I see things on this timeline that I am definitely well aware of. So the first thing I see, Plessy versus Ferguson. So my brain should be all lit up here thinking about, the Jim Crow laws, Plessy, Supreme Court, separate but equal. That was important. And I remember with this Jim Crow stuff, here's an example. So here's Jim Crow in action with the water fountains. Then I'm looking at this redlining map of Chicago. Neighborhoods where minorities live have been highlighted in red. Interesting. So minorities seem to be clustered in different locations. Very interesting. Some cities throughout the country began passing zoning laws that prohibit black families from moving onto majority white blocks. Okay, so already we have some, I'm going to call them segregation laws in place. And I'm wondering if this directly ties again to Chicago. So this kind of answers my earlier question. Was it a national issue or was it a state issue? It appears to be cities who are directing the different rules. Franklin D. Roosevelt, I know his programs were called the New Deal, and I know he became president in 1933. Leads to the creation of segregated public housing and all-white suburbs, causing cities to be more segregated. All right, I don't think of Franklin Roosevelt in this context related to race. I know he had members in his cabinet who were African American, called his Black Cabinet. So I'm wondering, is FDR racist? That's where I'm going with this. Or was he pressured to make some kind of policies? Brown v. Board, I know overturns Plessy. So maybe I want to make some kind of connection here between the two. So here's Plessy, here's Brown. This will be the case that says separate but equal is totally wrong. And it overturns that in 54, allowing for the integration of schools, like we see here, this famous picture where this young African-American girl is facing a young white girl. I might glance at this picture, sorry about the coughing, where Martin Luther King is speaking. Here we are back to Chicago again in 66, so I'm 1 year old when this is happening as a reference to my own life. Martin Luther King Jr.'s forgotten fight against Northern segregation. So I know he helped lead the Montgomery bus boycott after Rosa Parks chose to kind of be the test case there. But I didn't know that he traveled extensively in the North. I don't think I have that knowledge. And I'm just skimming this real quick. I see mentions of New York City, mentions of Detroit. They're mentioning LA, and here's Chicago. So I might read that in more depth later. And then here's the other half of that timeline. The Civil Rights Act. Oh, now here's President Johnson. So I know he became president after JFK. Fair Housing Act, President Johnson. So it looks like Lyndon Baines Johnson, President Johnson, is all about helping to end segregation. At least that's what appears here. In 74, after Boston formulates a plan to integrate schools by busing students, riots erupt. Okay, I'm wondering who rioted. Whites, blacks, city people, country folk, the students. It's the most famous of the movements in the North to oppose busing. Okay, and I'm not exactly sure who was being bused where, but I'm thinking the attempt here was to integrate schools, which then ties back to Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. I might want to double check my date and timeline there. Yeah, there it is. Do I have these in the correct order? 18, 19, 20, 21. Okay, I do. And then finally, persistent segregation. Today, students protest segregation in their schools. So are New York schools segregated and de facto segregation? Or are they actually segregated based on people's legally being told that that's supposed to happen? So this, I apologize. This says hundreds of public school students in New York State take part in demonstrations calling. Okay, so I know students now, these people do look young. I know they're activists and interested in this particular topic. Rosa Parks once called Detroit the northern promised land that wasn't. All right, so I get a sense here that this article is going to be disrespecting, maybe, dissing the North a little bit for maybe being two-faced about condemning the South, when in reality, the North also had its share of issues. So I'm going to shift colors now and get into my reading. But all of that pre-reading stuff that I did has activated my brain and prepared me to start reading. On February 3rd, 1964, nearly 500,000 students joined together to protest segregation in local education. Okay, I don't really know where we're talking about right now. Where are we? Most of them were African American and Puerto Rican. They decided not to go to class that day. Instead, they marched in front of their schools shouting, "Jim Crow must go." I do not believe I've ever seen that slogan written out before. I've heard white kids screaming, 2468, "We don't want to integrate." I've heard that chant. But here, "Jim Crow must go." That's powerful. They held signs with slogans such as "Integration means better education" and sang "We shall overcome," which, if you've ever heard that song, that's pretty powerful. We shall overcome. It's kind of done real spiritually. It's been 56 years since that demonstration took place. In the end, it turned out to be the largest civil rights protest of the decade. But it didn't take place in the South where you might have expected. It happened in New York City. Okay, so here's my answer to my location. This is NYC that this February 500,000 student thing took place. Okay, New York. So I want to make sure I know that as context. The city's public education remained heavily segregated 10 years after the landmark decision of the Supreme Court in Brown v. Board of Education. In the ruling, the court declared that separate schools for black children and white children were unconstitutional. And again, Brown v. Board overturned Plessy v. Ferguson. Plessy v. Ferg. The history of the civil rights movement usually focuses on the South. And for sure, as a teacher, I definitely see this focus, even in textbooks. You know about the sit-ins. I don't know if you guys know about the sit-ins. But remember, sit-ins, boycotts are marches, Greensboro, North Carolina, Birmingham, Alabama. Those acts of protest led to the passage of legislation such as the Civil Rights Act. So I'm remembering Lyndon Baines Johnson was president then in 1964, which outlawed segregation. So here's the act, and then maybe I'm going to see if I can find myself a greenish highlighter, and here's what it did. Okay. But state-sponsored segregation also existed in the North. Okay, so I'm not shocked by this. I kind of expect this. But as we're moving forward, I'm not supposed to say shocked, but how much? I think when I think of the North, how much of an issue was segregation, racism in the North? Yeah, I knew it existed. Thousands of people joined in civil rights movements outside the South, from New York to Boston to Detroit. So why haven't you heard as much about them? I think that's my million-dollar question. We often portray racism in the U.S. as a regional problem, not a national problem. Now, maybe I need to shift my own mindset as I read. Shift my mindset, because I have seen this as an issue in the South. The maps that we've looked at show the lynchings predominantly in the South. Lynching in South. So I really got to open my mind and listen closely to what they're telling me about the North. So Jean Theoharis, author of a book on civil rights movement, her book is called A More Beautiful and Terrible History. So I don't know much about Jean here. I'm wondering if she is African American. I'm wondering if she's white, Hispanic, what her nationality is, what her connections are to the whole issue. And I'm also wondering is she a doctor? Is she, a professional person who does writing and research? Is she a newspaper reporter? I'm curious what led her to write this book. She says, I'm back to Gina, here's her quote, "The tendency when talking about segregation in the North is to say it's more episodic. So it's different episodes and more personal and not state-sponsored." So we have an individual, in Fairview who makes a rude comment to somebody of a different race or ethnic orientation. That's one episode, according to her, and that we don't see it as state-sponsored, except that we know that's not the case. So are you telling me racism and segregation are state-sponsored? Is that the thesis of this article? Because I don't know if I believe that. So as I read, I'm going to keep an open mind and look to see if they prove that. So now the reading is going to go back in time and trace you through some information, but this would take me a while to read thoughtfully and jot down notes in the columns. And of course, the very first step and thing I should have done is go and read the 4 questions that I know I have to respond to. So hopefully this helps give you some ideas on how to actively text talk and really be thoughtful and effortful as you read. Let's head on to a new screencast where we do look at the questions and maybe model answer one of them.